we're going to delve into this whole area and bring you a little bit more depth into the challenge of moving freight. Sorry, the challenge of supply chains. My apologies, Kevin. Let me introduce our panel. James White, technical lead at Western Gateway. James, are you with us? He is, yes. Maggie Simpson. Maggie is Director General at the Rail Freight Group, soon to be renamed. The Rail, maybe not, I don't know. Discuss Maggie. Clare James, Managing Director of East Midlands Airport. Is he with us? Yes, coming down there. And Richard Bradley, Head of Strategy at Midlands Connect. That should be 5. Yes, that's good. Where have we got? There, yeah, good. Excellent, right. I'm going to start with the SDBs. Hi, Maggie, thanks. James and Richard, start with you. How do you, bearing in mind what Kevin's just spoken about there, how do you think the SDBs can contribute to and influence the conversation around supply chains, freight at a regional scale? Where do you see you both add value? Who's going to start? James.
Shall I go first?
Yeah.
Yep, right. As part of the Western Gateway STB and working alongside with the Peninsula, we've just produced a freight strategy for the whole of the Southwest. Apologies, Kevin, we used the word freight in the title.
It's going to hang over us now, Kevin.
Yeah.
It's going to hang over us.
And I think it's probably fair to say that as local authorities, we have always treated, not intentionally, but treated freight more as a sort of Cinderella subject, left very much to the private sector to do our various local transport plans. Do normally pick up on freight, but don't take a really active role in it. So with this joint freight strategy for the whole of the Southwest, I think we want to reverse that and very much engage with the freight industry. We've got a whole list of something like 46 interventions in our freight strategy, of which around 10 or 11 or so are there for the STB to help support, or to lead rather, and then have a supporting role for all the remaining ones. And just coming back to your point about engagement, Kevin, one of the things we're setting up is a regional freight forum. Those with long memories might remember various regional freight partnerships that took place in the past, but this is very much about bringing together the industry, bringing together the local authorities, Network Rail, national highways, all into one forum to set the priorities for investment. Where do we need to go? What do we need to do next with encouraging freight? And making freight more sustainable and more efficient and supporting the economy and all that sort of wider context. So I hope you're going to be reassured by that, Kevin, that we are taking and we want to take freight much more seriously than perhaps we have done in the past. So we want to break down some of those silos really which have existed in the past as well, where as local authorities we've perhaps done things which haven't helped the freight industry and maybe even vice versa. So working very much in a collaborative approach. That's where we want to go. Okay. And I think that we all want to sing from the same hymn sheet, to use the usual cliche. But recognising that it is going to be challenging. The whole decarbonisation issue is going to be a major challenge around everything that we do. But there's plenty of scope there. As part of our freight strategy, we want to encourage a shift towards rail. We want to encourage a shift to coastal shipping, for example. I think that's a very much underutilised aspect. We have lots of small little ports all the way around the Southwest. Can we utilise those? Okay. Can we capture more markets and get a mode shift to remove lorries from the main network, to have those congestion and environmental benefits? So I hope we've got a very exciting time coming up with freight in the Southwest.
Okay, well I know, Kevin, you're keen to come back up, but Richard, first of all, just what's happening in the Midlands? I mean, home of freight, isn't it?
Thank you. Well, we're taking actually a Great Britain view, and the government's asked us, as the lead SDB for alternative fuels, to work together with other SDBs to find the best places to recharge, refuel, and for modal interchange. So we're working in what I think is the biggest SDB collaboration, with 6 SDBs working together.
We are.
Yeah. And we're actually going around using our site selection process to try and find the best locations for those sort of hubs. But we're not just looking at it from a bottom up, we're looking at it from a top down. We're looking at the island of Great Britain and the choice of transport mode, which we've done before, but we're adding to that fuel choice. And that view of the Great Britain world could end up with us supporting rail improvements at Ely in Cambridgeshire rather than in the Midlands, because that's a bottleneck for us in the Midlands. So we are taking that big view, and we are taking that bottom-up view of where the best place is to put these sort of hubs for refueling and recharging. But just going on to the supply chain, we're actually involved in a hydrogen truck proposal to run the trials in the Midlands if we're successful. And one thing we've done is taken a deep dive into the supply chain from that end user of the hydrogen truck all the way through to what the truck needs to be, how the truck and the trailer fits together, how the fuel's at the right place, how it's stored, how it's produced. And that deep dive into that supply chain has shown how complex it is to actually deliver a hydrogen truck. We're finding things like the refrigeration units getting in the way of the fuel cells when you try and join the two things together. So little details like that are what these demonstrators, if we're successful with the trials, will help us learn and help us more rapidly scale, because we'll remove those uncertainties and hopefully encourage the end user, the haulier, to actually be able to consider these trucks and also figure out what the government's role is to help make that affordable.
Okay. Maggie, we've spoken before about, I suppose, life without money in rail. The STBs are powerful. How can they help? There's a question, well, tackle that. I mean, how do you think the STBs can help to really transform freight supply chains across the UK?
Yeah, thank you. And, you know, at Rail Freight Group, we've had really good relationships with all the STBs and really valued the work that every single one of them has done or is doing on freight. Some really thoughtful and joined up work, actually, and people working together as colleagues have you know, explained to look at supply chains. You know, that notwithstanding, it was 11:41 today before anyone said the word freight and hadn't said supply chains as well. So perhaps we've got a little way to go, yes, on getting that integrated. And I think, you know, it was Steve Gooding who said earlier about making sure that we plan transport first, and freight's absolutely part of that, that if we start to make, you know, exciting plans about cycleways or personal mobility, but we've forgotten how the lorries are going to get through, in Kevin's case, or the trains in my case, then we're missing a trick. So I think there's more to do in terms of integrating freight into those plans. But you make a really good point about, you know, the fact there isn't any cash, certainly in the railways, maybe there is in roads, but there's certainly, you know, we are going to be into a cash-constrained phase. And those plans that the STBs have done so far have been very much about that infrastructure lobby. And what I'm really interested now is if, you know, of course we need to carry on doing that. We need to keep making the case for Ely. Ely is now paused, as I'm told, in government planning, but how do we get that unlocked as quickly as possible? But actually, what else could we do? Mm-hmm. What else could we do to help modal shift to rail in a world where there isn't any cash? And some of the points that have been made about the integration with spatial planning, and making sure that we can drive private sector money to the right places, because freight is a private sector endeavour. It wishes to invest, but it has to invest in the right places. Making sure that networks are optimised for freight as well as for passenger transport are probably some areas that are under-debated within the STB so far, and there could be more done. Okay, thanks, Maggie. Clare, East Midlands Airport, I mean, give us your views about, I suppose, what do airports need from STBs to really transform your ability to assist with freight transport. I mean, reflect also on the fact that, you know, the conversation we had earlier about free ports. I mean, what impact does that have?
Hi, yeah. So I think it all plays to the words I've heard several times, both sat in the audience and sat up here, around that sort of integrated and collaborative plan, because nothing can happen in isolation. And to the point about supply chains, you know, air cargo, air freight, sorry, use the F word, but, you know, that is an important part of the supply chain. So how do we integrate and really capitalise on all those various modes of transport, which is what, leading on to the Freeport, we do as the only airport-centred inland multimodal Freeport. But what we need to do to really capitalise on that is make sure all the infrastructure, the roads, the maritime freight hub, our airport, all integrate and work together to deliver the best
Because
outcome.
that system doesn't work, one bit of that system doesn't work, it all falls down.
Absolutely.
And so what do you need, going back to the conference today, SDBs, what do you need SDBs around the UK to do to assist in your endeavours in East Midlands?
So, from my perspective, there's a couple of things. One, the green agenda is massive. It won't surprise the audience here, but a bit like the railways, we were the first to be hit by the pandemic. We're the last to come out of it. An awful lot of money has been lost in the aviation industry, and an awful lot of investment needs to go into it to really green up the aviation sector. It's happening, but we need to work together because the infrastructure for hydrogen, the electricity required to liquefy gaseous hydrogen is phenomenal. So we really need that integrated plan across all the sectors to make this work. Mm-hmm. Okay. From my airport perspective, I need better connectivity. I need better rail links. 90% of my passengers drive to the airport because the public transport's not good enough. So, we work closely with Midlands Connect, and we'll continue to do, but it is really joining up. And it goes back to that, helicopter view, how do we link? We can't do it in isolation. East Midlands, we serve 186 cities globally. 74% of the alpha cities are reached within one stop from East Midlands Airport. So we can't look at this in isolation.
Okay. Kevin, are you liking what you're hearing?
Some of it. I mean, just to pick up on something that Claire said, I mean, in terms of understanding, for example, the majority of air freight moves in the belly hold of passenger aircraft, which is something that isn't often understood. I think the difficulty when you look at, Maggie and I sit on the DFT Freight Council. It's all of the trade associations and ourselves as the professional body that are associated with logistics and transport. Logistics, transport is a derived demand. If you are going to effectively engage, you need the manufacturers and you need the retailers, because they're the ones who tell you when to pick it up, where to take it, when to deliver it, and what to do with the returns. All the logistics companies are doing is responding to that demand and planning within it as effectively as they can. So just talking to the transport companies ain't going to hack it, because they're almost hire and reward, if you like, with increasing levels of planning associated with it. You've got to get the manufacturers and retailers.
Okay. Well, there's a question here from an anonymous. How can we get more freight transport and logistics into STB community and into transport planning strategy practices? Andrew, what do you think? Sorry, James.
It's James.
Who's Andrew? Andrew's the last. James, sorry.
I think it's very much about helping our local authorities to make sure that their local plans and their local transport plans have freight supply chains built in from the very start. So to get away from that sort of Cinderella image that freight has had in our local planning policies, probably for as long as I've been involved in transport planning. I think it's also about the STBs trying to take a very active role as well. I mean, just to give you one example, in the southwest as a whole, something like 22% of all HGV movements are actually empty loads, either running into the area or out of the area. Our freight strategy has an intervention around trialling out a pilot scheme to do match loading. I mean, it's nothing new, it has been done before, but is there potential there for the STB to have that coordinating role, to bring in everybody? And actually, I fully take your point, Kevin, about involving the manufacturers as well in our freight forum. So we'll take that away and act upon that.
Okay, Nathan Carroll, a question for Richard. On the selection of transport multimodal hub locations, are considerations around energy network capacity feeding into this made?
First of all, yes. But when we talk to the network, the energy network providers, we were talking to one on Monday, in fact, there's a need to actually map out where these hubs, where these key refueling, recharging and modal interchange places might happen, and then to map on top of that the availability of the grid, the availability of the national grid, electric and gas. And that hasn't happened. So we have got indications of where the grid has capacity, but we need to then map on top the first draft of this network of hubs.
Okay. There's another question here. Maybe Maggie, you can take this. I've always felt that freight is not sexy enough to be taken seriously. Is that changing? And I suppose, going forward from that, do you think that the issues we've seen over COVID in terms of the impact of freight and logistics breaking down, is that changing not only the public's view of it, but maybe local authorities, STB's views of the importance of getting it right?
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't understand why anybody wouldn't think that freight is sexy, because it's absolutely the most interesting bit of transport. And, I'm sure others as well, it is a privilege to work in a sector where you can
call
go
it
and
what you
see
like.
A port or a quarry or a warehouse or a manufacturing facility or a steel plant or a grain store and not think that those things which absolutely underpin our economic success are not sexy. It's I don't get it, by the by. But I think what's happened during Brexit and COVID is that supply chains have wobbled, but ultimately they've delivered. So yeah, we had some empty forecourts, but within a week that wasn't a story anymore. And actually it showed how resilient supply chains are in the face of what has been some of the biggest economic shocks. So people talk about the amount of money that the passenger railway had. For example, the freight railway didn't have any money. And it was very difficult actually to get through that and survive. But we did, and so did our road colleagues and air colleagues and others. So it's a very, very resilient sector. And I think that's the message that has really resonated with political stakeholders, is that they've understood that this is something that if it fails has really, really profound implications for each and every one of us. But when it succeeds, we don't notice it.
Okay.
Can I just add
absolutely.
as well, not to dismiss the point that a lot of freight does go in the belly-holder passenger aircraft, but during COVID there were no passenger aircraft, and the express freight hub at East Midlands was what got the PPE, the vaccines and everything into this country. Mm-hmm. And that express facility is something that is increasing being relied on now for quick, safe and secure delivery of really important imports and exports.
But of course, a lot of your business is also being driven by changing patterns in demand. I mean, do you see that kind of that desire by the public to have next day deliveries, notwithstanding what Glenn was talking about us needing to change our ways? Is that something which you're expecting to just carry on?
To an extent, yes. And I think, the point was made in an earlier speech around these nice to have holidays. It's not just about holidays, it's not just about connecting freight and supply chains, it's connecting families. We're a global society now. So as much as we will absolutely work to address the carbon agenda, you're not going to rewind so much so that travel, goods, the globalisation is going to retrench that much. So I do think a lot of this is here to stay.
Yeah.
And I think on that, when you order the Amazon parcel and it turns up the next day and it's a biro or a pair of socks or whatever, it hasn't, come from China overnight, has it? It came from China 6 months ago in a container on a ship to a port, and then it was taken by a train into a warehouse, probably in the English Midlands, and then it was sat in there until you ordered it, when it came on a truck to another warehouse and eventually into that van that landed to you. So online is absolutely changing the shape of freight and logistics across the country. But the core elements of that supply chain, that long distance, long haul trunking move, the shipping moves, the port move, are the same as they've always been. And we forget that downstream piece is constant and to some degree predictable as well.
But just I suppose to carry on with this idea that the supply chains, the freight sector is a hugely national endeavour. It's all joined up. James, there's a question here that says an STB joint approach would be hugely supportive to influence wider national strategy. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I do. I think that there's obviously strength in the two SDBs coming together for a single freight strategy for the whole Southwest. I would hope it will give us a voice to go and talk to the Department for Transport, to talk to the industry, to talk to the manufacturers. I think it's also something obviously that needs to be reflected across all the STBs as well. I know several of the STBs have produced their own. I think, Rupert, you've got a freight strategy for the South East, haven't you? Richard, sorry. My fault. Midlands, you're Midlands, right, sorry. Beg your pardon there. That shows how much joined up work
There's
is
no
going
joined
on,
up.
doesn't it?
There's not even joined up thinking across the panel here. It's a shocker. But
yeah, that's the point, really. That, we need to work together.
But I suppose, Claire, I mean, going back to the Freeport status, in many ways, and I suppose what you're trying, what this, by creating 8 Freeports around the country, does it in many ways set up a more of a competitive advantage, which stops that kind of interaction between regions?
No, I mean, if you think about what we're trying to do, it's to encourage foreign investment. So, that is the purpose. Each Freeport has got its own unique offering. Ours is inland, it's the airport centred. There are others that are clearly more seaport focused. But the whole purpose of this is to encourage that shift away from Europe to get investment into the UK. And if you look at the East Midlands alone, I think we're the 4th biggest region from a foreign investment perspective after London, the South East and Scotland. So this is just going to add to the value that we can bring.
But you get that argument there that there is a potential just relocation of resources towards reports rather than creating new resource. It's actually just it focuses that existing resource in one area.
The way that the incentives are working is it's all around encouraging new business rather than the relocation of existing businesses. So that's where the focus is.
Okay. Let's talk about, we talked about I suppose the general issues around freight. What about going into some of the issues that were raised by Rachel and Glenn, and talk about I suppose what is potentially a game changer around home deliveries, which is low carbon EV delivery vehicles. You mentioned it, Kevin. Is that something you're not buying the idea of having 10-ton batteries in HGVs, but there's clearly a role for EV bikes, EV vans, that kind of smaller delivery vehicles.
Yeah, there certainly are in the urban environment. As I mentioned, I think when you get into the rural environment, that's a real challenge. I mean, cargo bikes have been proven to be more efficient than actually vans, because in London you can actually park directly outside the property rather than trying to find a spot if you can find one. And if you're going around Clapham Common at rush hour and it's busy, well, you ride across the common. They're about 30% more effective, but they do require micro hubs. You've got to get the product to the bike.
Yeah.
And that's potentially where rail, because what have we got in the centre of cities? Railway stations. And typically, not far up the line, we've probably got some goods yards or sidings that could be used. It is a challenge. I mean, at the moment, I think the logistics sector is pretty clear on urban, a little bit unsure on rural, very unsure on long haul. Modal shift to rail is a real opportunity, but capacity is a restriction. And the other thing is, where are those strategic rail freight interchanges going to be built, and how do they link in to the wider supply chain network?
Well, Maggie, what's the answer to that? And what is the RFG's strategy on encouraging EV distribution vehicles?
Okay, so I don't have a strategy on EV on the road network. I think it's important that we look at the rail land estate and include in that, for lots of reasons. The points about power are well made, and actually somebody told me the other day, amongst some rail freight operators, 25% of their emissions are their staff getting to work. So putting battery charging points in rail freight hubs is a no-brainer for lots of reasons. I think, whichever mode of decarbonisation we look at, whether that's overhead electrification, battery, hydrogen, EVs, one place where there's a real gap for my members and other parties in freight is that kind of structural piece about allocation, about infrastructure, and about the sort of decision-making process in government. So, I sort of paraphrase, but you say, can we have some overhead electrification? No, it's too expensive. Can we have some hydrogen? No, it's going into the gas network. Mm-hmm. There isn't enough lithium in the world. What should we do? Oh, net zero 2050. Somebody's got to take some strategic decisions here that says, actually, we are going to electrify that bit of the railways, or we are going to allow that much hydrogen to be used for HGV, or you can have some synthetic fuel and it won't all be in aircraft, because if we don't do that, we're actually stopping people today taking decisions today that could reduce carbon today.
Well, there's a question from Louise Wicks. Will a road rail freight integration strategy be developed to inform the future locations of SRFIs, strategic rail freight interchanges?
So, I mean, look, on SRFIs, people say to me, there's a great field over there, it's got a railway line, it could be an SRFI. And I'm like, no, it can't, because it hasn't got a road, it hasn't got any adjacent workforce, and actually it isn't in a place where people want to put a warehouse. So the reasons why people put their warehouses where they do are complicated, and they're about the populations that they serve. And actually, if we get freight wrong, if we put things in the wrong place or we build the wrong thing, it's you and I who pay for it, and we just add to the cost of living crisis.
Right.
So there's a distinction, I think, between letting the market say, you know, we really need warehousing here in the northwest. That's an area where we need warehousing at the moment, for example, or the southwest, for example. And then we start to look at the places where that road and rail connectivity is available, but it has to be market driven.
Right. And I mean, is there a role for STBs in there, Richard?
Yeah, absolutely. I talked a minute about modal interchange, which included road rail freight. The site has to be on a good trade route, which is what Maggie's saying effectively. So the role, our core remit to government is to provide advice on the major road and rail infrastructure. So where we can start repositioning that is to make sure that these sort of sites have got the best infrastructure to them, and so making it easier for the logistics businesses to actually use them. So that's in our gift to plan that, to give evidence, to recommend that.
Yeah. Claire, you just say put it at the airport, wouldn't you?
It is at the airport. If you go to East Midlands Go-Way, it is literally at the airport.
Okay.
Look, sorry, can I just make another point on that?
Yeah.
Because we're talking a lot about warehousing here, but there's a huge amount of freight that moves that isn't warehousing. That's bulk freight, construction materials, stone, cement, steel, and these products are also essentials for our cities. And one of the bits where I think SDPs could be really powerful is in helping local planning bodies zone for industrial land for all its uses, not just warehousing. Because if we don't get it right for those bulk commodities as well, we've probably missed a trick.
Okay. Quick question. I mean, Ash raises this issue. Can we have the panel's views on the shiny new tech, the shiny new tech for supply chains, self-driving shuttles, drones, hyperloops? Should we focus on the innovation of decarbonisation? What do we already have? Claire, what's your thoughts on shiny new tech?
Well, there's a lot of work going on in the aviation sector. I mean, we've already got the sustainable aviation fuels. There's work now on the hydrogen. DHL have just launched their Alice aircraft, totally electric cargo aircraft with quite a reasonable range, actually, of about 800 miles. And then it's what's the next iteration. So perhaps to your point, Kevin, about those rural communities, that's where you could look at the use of the autonomous vehicles for deliveries and how we can use that. So there's lots of work going on in that space, and it's exciting stuff. We just need to work quicker. But it goes back to the point around joining it up, because if everybody's working in isolation, I think somebody earlier mentioned silos, that's where we end up spending too much money, not aligning, and ending up with a whole knitting mess rather than a really coherent strategy that links both moving people, cargo, freight, and getting the best out of all of our assets.
But I suppose also, James, is there a risk of thinking that technology is going to come to our salvation when it's really a policy issue? It's a strategy issue.
Yeah, I think I tend to agree. I think with certain aspects of technology, I think drones, yes, I think they've got a role to play, but it could be a real distraction, because actually I think technology is there really to improve the efficiency of the supply chains. There's a lot that technology can do. Just to give you an example, there's a 5G trial going on around the Port of Bristol at Avonmouth, where something like 70% of the local traffic is HGVs. The way the road layout is set out and the junctions are set out, it's not designed for HGVs, but by using the 5G technology, tracking the movements of HGVs, you can improve the flow of those vehicles through the junctions, and so relieve congestion and speed up delivery time. So I think it's easy to get tied up with the glamorous, the sexy side of technology, but actually there's some fairly basic stuff that technology can do to improve the way everything operates.
Kevin?
Yeah, you can get very wound up on things like drones. I mean, let's get realistic. You know, that ASOS warehouse I talked about, 650,000 orders on their peak day. Well, you ain't going to send out 650,000 drones from Barnsley to try and get down to London to knock on the window of a 13th floor flat and say your delivery's here. It's just absolute nonsense.
Well, you say that.
It ain't going to happen. What we will see, point-to-point movements, things like blood supplies, emergency movements, you know, where you've got a known route in some difficult-to-reach areas, you know, drone technology will be applicable. I think if you look at autonomous vehicles for rural areas, well, you've got to bear in mind in rural, the delivery size typically is smaller. You know, you're unlikely to be taking a full load. So who's going to unload the vehicle? Who's actually going to get it to your door? And if you're delivering fertilizer to a farm and there's only one pallet, are you then reliant on the farmer taking off, or are you going to crane it off the truck yourself? Where technology is becoming, you know, really relevant, there are 9 elements of what's called supply chain 4.0. We did used to look at them in isolation, things like blockchain, additive manufacturing, big data. Those things are all converging, and the logistics companies, you know, whether it's through planning systems, whether it's through tech that's deployed, are really pushing all of this stuff at the moment. There's some fantastic deployment that we're seeing. I don't think we'll go fully robotic, not for the next 30 years. What we're seeing is augmented systems coming in. You know, I can see at a point in time exoskeletons being used to support warehouse operations, for example, and heavy-to-lift activity. But yeah, forget the drones and all that kind of stuff. It's just guff.
Okay. Well, there you go. That's your parting retirement gift to the industry. There you go. Thanks, Kevin. Maggie, when you look at some of the developments in the supply chains in freight, a lot of it is driven most of it is driven by the private sector. I mean, what does the private sector need to have a louder voice in driving the strategies and the kind of ideas that we need to see happen?
Well, I mean, I think there's a really good point about engagement and getting engagement with the right people. But if you're in the private sector and you work in freight and logistics, what you're doing is, you know, getting involved in logistics. And with all due respect to our STB colleagues, you're probably not going around 7 STBs on a weekly basis, having meetings about strategies. And that's always the dilemma. If you've got very slim, efficient private sector businesses, it's how do you leverage the very best of them to inform the strategies that you want. And I mean, I'd like to say that's the role of trade associations, that's the gap we're trying to broker. But actually getting out there on an occasional basis, seeing those businesses that you have got, understanding what really drives the economics of their business, what could they do to employ more people, help you with some of those externalities and inform those strategies. I couldn't recommend that enough.
No, I suppose, Richard, that's one of the roles of the STB, to try to help your private sector partners to leverage those opportunities.
Absolutely, and we do, Maggie, we do go out to see. I was talking to Freshlink recently, who grow potatoes in Boston, ship them through Spalding, and just going back to the technology piece, some of the technology they need is very, very simple. So if we're going to get them to move their potatoes or their big goods onto rail at Spalding, if there was an interchange there in the future, then it's the T-junctions where their trunking route is getting stuck on a right turn and delayed 10 minutes. So they're saying if you can just get us out of those T-junctions, we'll then be there on time for a train in the future. We're not on time at the moment for the lorry that's waiting to distribute us to Marks and Spencer's. Okay. So we do. There's an awful lot of people to talk to. That's one of the problems. Okay.
I've got a final question that I want to put to you around the role of STBs of achieving different outcomes. But before that, there's a question that I think it's got to be for Kevin, really. Anonymous. 30-odd years ago, my milk was delivered in a reused glass bottle by an EV. Where did it all go wrong?
Mine still is. Milk and more. Get on it, folks.
Actually, so is mine.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I mean, and it's very pertinent in the sense that we expected milk to be there every morning at a set time. Now we buy on convenience when we want it. So actually, if you had a daily delivery, and it still exists in some part of the areas, we're not geared up for that anymore. You run low in the fridge, you go and buy some more. You don't build your life around a constant supply. But there are some things that we should look at to go back, because not only did they deliver milk, but increasingly they were delivering bread and fresh products and things like that. Maybe it's something that we should consider.
In Maggie in my world, it still happens.
Yeah.
There you go. Right, final point. In a sentence, in a few words, what needs to happen to put freight up front and central to our national transport strategy? Richard?
Better data. At the moment, the data is very weak on the number of times goods are handled, and so we're effectively looking at you jumping over the fence and picking the carrot out of the field and boiling it rather than going to the supermarket and all the logistics involved.
James?
Yeah, I agree. Better data, but also engaging and understanding the supply chains.
Okay. Claire?
Integration. Don't work in silos. Have a plan.
Okay. Maggie, what do you think?
Great big sign in every office that says, don't forget freight.
Don't forget?
Freight.
Freight, okay, fine. Don't forget supply chains.
Sorry, supply chains.
And finally, Kevin?
No, I think people summed it up well there. Understanding is absolutely fundamental. Joined up thinking is absolutely fundamental, and that sign should say forget freight, focus on supply chains.
Thank you very much. And I'd have to say, and use your milkman. Use your milkman. Thank you very much. Thanks to our panel. Thanks Maggie, Claire, Richard, James, Kevin.